That morning in the fall of 1944, the mess hall at Camp Gordon filled with the familiar noise of metal trays and heavy boots. The air carried the smell of boiled potatoes and coffee thick with chicory. It was a place where order mattered. Every man, whether soldier or prisoner, knew when to move, when to stop, when to sit. But that day, a single man broke the rhythm. A German prisoner in worn khaki hesitated midway through the line, tray in his hands, eyes steady on the American guard, standing near the table. He did not speak. He simply stopped, refusing to move forward until the guard joined him. The guard, a young corporal from Tennessee, noticed the pause but said nothing. Around them the line of prisoners shuffled uneasily. The kitchen crew looked up from the serving counter, unsure what rule had been broken. The corporal had seen defiance before, sharp words, hidden smirks, but this was different. The prisoner's stillness carried no challenge, only a quiet insistence that he would not eat alone. For a moment the hum of the hall faded. Then the corporal took a step closer, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. He asked if there was a problem. The prisoner shook his head, his English rough but clear. "You eat, I eat." No one laughed. A cook froze with a ladle midair. It was a strange reversal, a captured man inviting his guard to share a meal, as if manners had somehow survived the war. Later, in the small office behind the kitchen, the corporal told the mess sergeant what had happened. The sergeant, a man who'd seen too many rule books to care about another one, shrugged it off. "If he's not starting trouble, let him sit where he wants," he said. But the corporal couldn't let it go. Something about the way the prisoner had waited, patient, respectful, had unsettled him. It wasn't disobedience, it was dignity. That evening, after roll call, the corporal walked past the compound fences. The camp stretched wide under the dim light of flood lamps, barracks rows, laundry lines, a chapel built from leftover timber. The prisoners were quiet now, their day finished with the same monotony that had shaped their captivity for months. Yet in one small detail, the meal refused, the gesture offered, something human had cracked through the pattern. In the following days, the corporal began to notice more of these small exchanges, a prisoner offering to help sweep the floor after dinner, another fixing a broken latch on the kitchen door without being told. None of it was required, yet none of it felt staged. The men carried themselves with a kind of order that didn't belong to either side. The corporal, once cautious to maintain distance, started to greet them by name. It wasn't friendship, not in the way people like to label it later. It was understanding, built quietly over coffee and bread. One afternoon, rain hammered the tin roof of the mess hall. The corporal stood by the window, watching the puddles form outside the fence. The same prisoner, the one who had refused to eat, was wiping down tables. When their eyes met, the prisoner nodded just once, as if confirming something already agreed upon. The corporal nodded back. No words, no rules, just recognition. That night, lying in his narrow bunk, the corporal thought about his younger brother back home, who worked the same shift in a cotton mill and probably sat at the same hour for supper. He wondered if the German prisoner thought of home too, if, in that shared silence at the table, they had both reached across something neither could name. By the end of the week, the gesture had become quiet routine. When the corporal entered the hall, the prisoner waited until he sat. No one questioned it anymore. In a place built on hierarchy and suspicion, that small ritual stood apart. It wasn't mercy, and it wasn't rebellion. It was integrity, two men following an unwritten rule of respect in a world that had forgotten it. Over the next few weeks, the air in the camp shifted in ways hard to measure. The mess line moved as always. The food was the same, but the tone, how the men looked at one another, how they moved, grew less mechanical. The corporal noticed that the prisoners spoke more softly among themselves, not out of fear but something else, a kind of attentiveness. Even the guards began to ease the stiffness in their posture. No one said it aloud, yet the silence before each meal began to carry weight, as though the pause itself demanded a kind of respect. Each morning, the corporal walked from his quarters past the guard tower to the kitchen. The path ran along the fence where prisoners sometimes gathered to watch the sunrise. The same German prisoner, the one whose refusal had started it all, often stood there with his hands tucked behind his back. He would nod when the corporal passed. There was no conversation, but there was familiarity now. It was strange comfort in a place meant to keep distance. One Friday, the mess hall ran short on supplies. The truck from Augusta was late, and the men had little to serve. The cooks opened the last cans of beans, stretching them thin across the trays. When the prisoners saw the rations, no one complained. The corporal expected restlessness, maybe irritation, but instead the German prisoner stepped forward and offered to help in the kitchen. He said, in his broken English, that he had worked in a restaurant before the war. The corporal hesitated, knowing the rule book frowned on it, but something in the man's expression made him wave him in. The prisoner worked with quiet precision, stirring, seasoning, portioning each tray as if it were a matter of honor. When the corporal tasted the food, it was better than it had been in weeks. He didn't mention it to the sergeant. It was one of those small moments better left unrecorded, a secret kept between men who understood that discipline and decency could live side by side. That evening, when the hall emptied, the prisoner stayed to scrub the pots. The corporal leaned against the doorway, watching him rinse the last of the suds from a steel pan. He thought about how odd it was that a man once trained to fight him now cleaned his dishes without bitterness. It made the camp feel less like an outpost of war and more like a waiting room for something beyond it. By mid-December, the weather turned cold. Frost gathered on the window frames, and the stoves burned longer to keep the food warm. The corporal began sharing his coffee during night duty, pouring an extra cup for the same prisoner when he saw him sweeping the floor. No one ordered it. It was habit now. When the prisoner drank, he lifted the tin mug with a small nod, never smiling but always meeting the corporal's eyes. It was not camaraderie, not forgiveness, but a recognition that both of them were bound by the same hunger for order, for decency, even inside the wire. Then came Christmas Eve. The camp chaplain organized a short service in the recreation hut, open to guards and prisoners alike. The corporal didn't plan to attend, but when he heard the faint singing, German voices blending with the few American ones, he stood outside the door and listened. The hymn was unfamiliar, yet hauntingly calm. When it ended, the men filed out quietly, passing him without a glance, their breath rising in the cold night. The German prisoner stopped, nodded once, and handed him something small, a folded paper star cut from a ration box. No words. The corporal kept it in his breast pocket for the rest of his life. After that night, the ritual at the table continued, but it carried new meaning. When the prisoner waited for the corporal before eating, the others followed. Soon it was not one man, but several who paused until a guard sat. What had begun as one man's act of refusal had become a quiet custom, a mutual courtesy that no rule could enforce and no officer could forbid. It was strange, the corporal thought later, how integrity worked in silence. It didn't shout or demand, it just waited, patient, as the man who once refused to take his meal. And in that patience, the camp found a rhythm more human than any regulation could write. Winter deepened, and with it came a kind of stillness that wrapped around the camp like fog. The guards bundled in their coats, breath forming small clouds under the floodlights. The prisoners marched to work in the fields with shovels over their shoulders, their boots crunching in the frozen dirt. The war was far away now, though its echo never quite left. News came through the radio, rumors of Allied advances, cities taken, fronts collapsing, but inside the wire, time moved differently. Each day was measured not by victory or defeat, but by meals, by weather, by the quiet rituals that kept men from losing themselves. One morning, before dawn, the corporal entered the mess hall to find the prisoner already there, setting out the chairs. It was against regulation, but he didn't send him away. Instead, he watched as the man moved with deliberate care, placing each chair at the same distance, adjusting the tray so that every spot looked identical. The corporal realized he'd seen that kind of order before, not in the military, but in his father's church back home in Tennessee, where pews had to be straight before the Sunday service. It struck him that even behind barbed wire, a man could still practice reverence. When breakfast began, the usual clang of utensils filled the room. The corporal sat at his post near the entrance, his coffee cooling in his hand. The prisoner reached the head of the line, took his tray, and again waited. Their eyes met. The corporal hesitated, then took his seat. Only then did the prisoner sit, bowing his head briefly before eating. It was the same motion as always, but the corporal noticed the detail he had missed before. The prisoner's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his spoon. It wasn't fear or cold. It was restraint. He was holding himself in check, as if the simple act of sharing a meal still carried the weight of something sacred. Later that week, a new officer arrived to inspect the camp. He was young, sharp, and eager to enforce the letter of the manual. During lunch, he noticed the prisoner and the corporal sitting near each other and frowned. Afterward, he called the corporal into his office. He reminded him that fraternization blurred the chain of authority, that respect came from distance. The corporal listened without argument. He knew the rules better than anyone. But when the officer finished, the corporal simply said, "He waits. I sit. That's all." The officer paused, unsure whether it was defiance or discipline that held in those words. In the end, he let it pass. The following Sunday, a light snow began to fall. It dusted the rooftops of the barracks and softened the sharp edges of the fences. From the mess hall window, the corporal watched the German prisoners standing outside, faces lifted toward the sky. For a moment, they looked like any group of men tasting winter for the first time. The prisoner who had refused to eat stood among them, his hands open to catch the flakes. The corporal found himself smiling, though he didn't know why. Maybe it was because he realized that integrity wasn't only about keeping rules, it was also about recognizing what was human on both sides of the fence. That night, as the men turned in, the generator failed, plunging the compound into silence. The floodlights dimmed. The guards lit lanterns and moved through the dark corridors, checking the locks. When the corporal reached the mess hall, he saw a faint glow from inside. The prisoner was there again, this time lighting a small candle at the center of one table. Its flame flickered weakly against the cold air, but it was steady. The corporal stood at the doorway watching. He could have ordered him back to quarters, but he didn't. He walked over, sat down across from him, and the prisoner nodded as if expecting him. They sat that way for a long time, not speaking, just two silhouettes in the dim light, the candle between them the only warmth in the room. The next morning, when the power returned and the camp came back to life, the candle was gone. Only a ring of wax remained on the table. The corporal said nothing, but he noticed the other prisoners began to clean the hall with unusual care, as though the place itself deserved more attention than before. Something unseen had taken root, an unspoken agreement that even captivity couldn't erode decency. By spring, rumors of the war's end reached them. The men grew restless, wondering when they'd be sent home. The corporal kept his distance, following orders, but he knew that soon the ritual at the table would end. He also knew he would miss it. For months, the quiet act of sitting together had taught him something no manual or sermon ever had, that respect could survive even in confinement, and that integrity, once shared, did not belong to one flag alone. The end came quietly, as most endings do. One April morning, a telegram arrived confirming that Germany had surrendered in the West. The camp buzzed with restrained excitement, though the prisoners themselves showed little outward joy. They had been gone too long, their faces lean, their eyes watchful. Freedom now seemed like a rumor they didn't yet trust. The guards, too, felt the strange weight of change. For months they had lived in a world defined by wire and schedules, and now the meaning of that order was dissolving. The corporal received orders to assist with repatriation. Names were read out, lists checked, trucks prepared. The men were to be transferred to ports for the long journey home. When the announcement reached the mess hall, a low murmur passed through the line. The German prisoner, the one who had first refused to eat, stood still, his tray untouched. The corporal noticed. Later, as the hall emptied, the man approached him. He said in his careful English, "I will go." "But we eat, one more time." The corporal nodded. It wasn't an order, but it felt like one that mattered. That evening, after the last meal had been served, the corporal waited in the empty hall. The prisoner entered quietly, carrying 2 tin trays. He set one down, poured coffee from a dented pot, and sat across the table. The overhead light buzzed faintly. Outside, the wind rattled the tin roof, carrying with it the distant sound of laughter from the guards' quarters. Inside, it was still. The 2 men ate without speaking. The food was the same as always, potatoes, bread, thin stew, but the act of eating it together made it something different, almost solemn. When they finished, the prisoner folded his napkin carefully, as if marking the end of a ritual. He looked at the corporal, hesitated, then reached into his pocket and placed something on the table, a small wooden spoon, sanded smooth and dark from use. "For you?" he said. The corporal turned it over in his hand. The handle bore a faint carving, 2 initials, one German, one American, joined by a thin line. The work was rough but deliberate. The corporal didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, his throat too tight for words. The next morning, the trucks arrived. The prisoners lined up by the gate, each man carrying a small pack. The guards stood at attention. When the corporal's unit was called to escort the convoy, he saw the German prisoner near the front of the line. Their eyes met once more. The man gave a small nod, not of farewell, but of understanding. Then the line moved, boots striking the dirt in steady rhythm, until the last truck disappeared beyond the trees. When the camp finally emptied, it felt hollow, as though sound itself had gone with them. The mess hall stood quiet. The corporal walked through it one last time, his footsteps echoing off the bare floor. On the table where the candle had once burned, he noticed the faint ring of wax still there, untouched by time or cleaning. He set the carved spoon beside it and left it there. Some things, he thought, weren't meant to be cleared away. Years later, long after the camp had been dismantled and its land turned back to pasture, the corporal, by then an old man, kept that wooden spoon in a drawer beside his medals. Sometimes, on winter nights, he would take it out, turn it over in his hands, and remember that Georgia mess hall. He would see again the prisoner's quiet refusal, the steady gaze, the simple act that had broken the machinery of war for just a moment. He never spoke much about it. When people asked what the war had taught him, he would pause, searching for words that didn't sound too grand. Finally, he would say, "That respect doesn't come from winning. It comes from how you sit at the table." Then he would fall silent, the memory returning in the small details, the clatter of trays, the smell of coffee, the sound of boots on concrete. In the end, the story wasn't about heroism or forgiveness. It was about 2 men who recognized each other's dignity in a place designed to erase it. And in that recognition, both found a measure of freedom before the war ever ended. The candle, the coffee, the waiting, all small gestures almost invisible, but they carried the weight of integrity, the kind that doesn't fade when uniforms change. That last morning in Georgia, the light came in low through the windows, washing the empty tables in gold. Dust floated in the beams, slow and quiet. The room smelled faintly of wood and soap. If anyone had walked in then, they might have thought it an ordinary mess hall, just another empty building after the war. But for those who had once sat there, it was something else, a place where silence had meant respect, and a meal shared had meant peace.